In the long and turbulent history of the Vietnam War, few battles were buried as deeply or for as long as the one that unfolded at a small jungle stream called Suoi Ong Thanh. To most Americans, the name means nothing. It never made headlines. It never appeared in wartime briefings. It was never spoken aloud by generals standing in front of microphones. And yet, on the morning of the 17th of October 1967, in a stretch of dense jungle northwest of Saigon, an entire U.S. battalion, more than 200 young men of the 2nd Battalion, 28th Infantry Regiment, walked into a disaster so sudden, so overwhelming, and so complete that the Army would spend nearly 25 years avoiding the truth. This story does not begin with a grand strategy or a dramatic clash of armies. It begins with something much quieter, a misunderstanding born from overconfidence, fueled by flawed intelligence, and sealed by a blind faith in technology. It begins with a group of American soldiers who believed they were walking into an empty forest. They were wrong. By the fall of 1967, the U.S. military had identified the region north of Saigon, what commanders called Tactical Zone H, as critical to the defense of the South Vietnamese capital. From Binh Duong to Tay Ninh, from Phuoc Long to Bien Hoa, this region was a patchwork of rubber plantations, ancient jungle, winding footpaths, and hidden streams. To American planners, it was simply the approaches to Saigon, a buffer zone to be controlled and cleaned out through aggressive patrols. The enemy operating in this terrain was the 271st Regiment, one of the most battle-hardened units of the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces. They had fought Americans before and won. They had ambushed convoys near Loc Ninh, struck outposts around Dao Tieng, and slipped away before American firepower could crush them. To U.S. commanders, eliminating this regiment was a priority. The solution, at least on paper, was the same one used across Vietnam: search and destroy. Helicopters, artillery, sensors, and air power would locate enemy formations, pin them down, and wipe them out. It had worked in training. It worked on maps. It worked in briefings delivered in cool, air-conditioned rooms at division headquarters. But the jungle north of Saigon was not a map. It was a maze. Thick canopy swallowed sunlight. Moisture muffled footsteps. Visibility sometimes dropped to 20 or 30 meters, barely the length of a suburban backyard. In that kind of terrain, American advantages, mobility, firepower, air support were muted. A well-placed rifleman with a single magazine could halt an entire platoon. A rocket-propelled grenade fired from behind a tree could punch through a squad without warning, and a regiment that understood the jungle could slip through it like smoke. Still, American confidence remained high. In June 1967, the 1st Infantry Division launched Operation Billings, claiming hundreds of enemy killed. When scattered ambushes and minor attacks continued, commanders insisted they were simply signs of a desperate, fleeing enemy. 2 months later came Operation Shenandoah II, a new push into the same region, with the same objective: destroy the 271st Regiment once and for all. General Jonathan Seaman, commanding the 1st Infantry Division, ordered his brigades to converge in a massive pincer movement. From the north and south, American troops would squeeze the Vietnamese forces into the jungle near Long Nguyen and crush them with overwhelming firepower. It was bold, it was confident, and it was built on a fundamental misunderstanding. Because while American commanders imagined the 271st Regiment preparing for battle, the regiment was in fact exhausted, marching for days, low on food, and simply trying to reach a supply unit near a small creek called Suoi Ong Thanh. They had no intention of fighting a major battle. They were not setting a trap. They were looking for rice. But war rarely cares about intentions. And in Vietnam, a single wrong assumption could ignite a firestorm. For decades after the war, American veterans who survived the battle would describe it as a nightmare they couldn't fully explain: a sudden explosion of gunfire, a fog of confusion, a sense of being attacked by an invisible enemy from every direction. They remembered the screams of wounded men. They remembered the radio static when they called for help. And they remembered the crushing realization that they had walked into something they did not understand. Their commanders understood it even less. Which is why, when the reports began to reach headquarters, the truth was pushed aside, rewritten, and eventually sealed away. What happened at Suoi Ong Thanh was not a small encounter, as early reports claimed. It was not a limited engagement. It was, by every measure, a catastrophe, and it would take nearly a quarter century for America to finally hear the truth. As Operation Shenandoah II unfolded, American commanders believed they were tightening the noose around an enemy on the verge of collapse. The maps in front of them, marked with arrows and colored overlays, suggested a familiar pattern. The Vietnamese regiment retreating westward, the American brigades closing in, the jungle thinning into ground, where air power could finally dominate. But the truth on the forest floor was very different. The region north of Saigon, stretching from the Michelin rubber plantations to the tangled forests of Binh Duong, was not an empty battlefield awaiting American control. It was a living ecosystem, shaped by humidity, shadows, and terrain that had swallowed armies long before the United States ever set foot there. Every elevation on the map hid something. Every dry stream could become an ambush lane. Every fallen log could conceal a man, a weapon, or a trap. And most importantly, the jungle refused to give away its secrets. For American infantrymen, the first step into that landscape was always the same: a drop in visibility. What looked green but navigable from above turned into a wall of foliage when approached on foot. Elephant grass towered over helmets. Vines snagged rifles. Tree trunks, as wide as truck tires, blocked entire squad formations. The men of the 2nd Battalion, 28th Infantry, known to their division as the Black Lions, were no strangers to this kind of terrain. They had patrolled it for months, fighting small skirmishes, tracking fleeting footprints, chasing shadows that always seemed one step ahead. But those previous missions had conditioned them into a dangerous assumption. If they hadn't found the enemy yet, then maybe the enemy wasn't there at all. In reality, the Vietnamese didn't reveal themselves unless they chose to. This imbalance, Americans searching blindly while Vietnamese troops observed quietly, was the silent force that shaped everything to come. At division headquarters, optimism remained high. Reports filtered upward claiming minor contacts, scattered enemy forces, and a general sense that the Vietnamese regiment was moving away from the converging American brigades. Aerial reconnaissance, limited by dense canopy, offered only partial glimpses. Intelligence summaries blended concrete sightings with hopeful interpretations. Commanders reassured each other that the pressure was working. Meanwhile, hundreds of feet below the flight paths of their helicopters, the jungle swallowed and distorted sound. Gunfire could travel miles. Footsteps vanished in soft moss. Echoes often pointed the wrong direction. Even seasoned pointmen lost their bearings in the dim light beneath the canopy. To the men on the ground, the forest seemed to breathe around them. They learned to read the jungle in ways that weren't in manuals. A broken twig, a faint cooking smell, a patch of flattened grass. But they also misread it, because the jungle of Binh Duong often resembled a stage reset after every storm, wiping away signs of life just as quickly as it revealed them. This was the environment into which the Black Lions were sent. General Seaman's plan relied heavily on coordination brigades, pushing in from opposite directions, sealing escape routes, and forcing the 271st Regiment into a kill zone. But the forest made coordination fragile. Radios crackled with static. Signals dropped. Units drifted off planned axes of advance as they tried to find passages through the brush. At times, entire companies moved like isolated islands, unable to see or hear each other. On October 16th, the day before the battle, one small sign hinted at the approaching crisis. Soldiers from several American companies reported encountering fresh campsites, ashes still warm, impressions in the soil where hammocks had hung. Yet even these clues were interpreted through the lens of optimism. The assumption was that the enemy had fled after hearing approaching helicopters, or after being shaken by previous airstrikes. This belief, unquestioned, untested, laid the foundation for everything that happened next. While the Americans continued their sweep, the Vietnamese regiment remained unseen. They were not running. They were not scattered. And they were not unaware. They monitored American movement through scouts who moved effortlessly along narrow footpaths. They communicated through coded taps and signals that blended into the natural sounds of the forest. They shifted positions quietly, sometimes only a few hundred meters from American troops who never detected them. The Vietnamese knew the Americans were coming long before the Americans understood where the Vietnamese had been. But at headquarters, planners saw only what they expected to see: a regiment retreating, a battlefield opening, an opportunity unfolding. So when a report arrived on October 16th claiming a large concentration of enemy troops near a small stream called Suoi Ong Thanh, the news was taken as confirmation not of danger, but of progress. The enemy seemed cornered. Orders were issued quickly: insert troops by helicopter, sweep the area, finish the job. No one imagined the enemy was already prepared. No one imagined the B-52 strikes would alert, not annihilate, the regiment below. No one imagined the next day would become one of the 1st Infantry Division's darkest hours. And none of the young men stepping off those helicopters knew that the jungle they were walking into had been watching them long before they ever saw it. While American commanders pushed deeper into the forests of Binh Duong, the men they were hunting, the soldiers of the 271st Regiment, were fighting a very different battle, not against U.S. forces, but against exhaustion, hunger, and the cruel mathematics of survival in a war fought far from supply lines. By mid-October 1967, the regiment had marched for days through the jungles of southeastern Vietnam. Their rations were nearly gone. Many fighters carried only a handful of roasted rice, a few pieces of dried cassava, or nothing at all. Some were sick. All were tired. Their objective was simple: reach Logistics Unit 83 near Suoi Ong Thanh, resupply, rest, and reorganize before continuing operations. They were not preparing for a showdown with a U.S. battalion. They were preparing for food. Yet even in this weakened state, the 271st Regiment carried with it something more powerful than ammunition or rations: discipline, sharpened through years of fighting in the very terrain that now concealed them. Colonel Von Min Treat, the regiment's commander, was a veteran who understood the jungle better than most. He knew the forest could shelter his men, but it could also betray them if they grew careless. Tired soldiers make mistakes. Hungry soldiers lose focus. And in this war, the margin between safety and disaster was measured in inches. So even during their march toward the supply point, Tritt enforced rigid discipline. Camps were built small and scattered. Fires were faint and brief. Sentries rotated through the night, listening for unnatural sounds among the insects and rustling leaves. Despite their hunger, no one broke formation to forage alone. Despite their exhaustion, no one removed their boots at night. Despite the lack of clear intelligence, no one assumed the Americans were far away. It was this discipline, quiet, almost invisible, that would soon prove decisive. On October 16th, Vietnamese scouts shadowing American helicopter movements returned with troubling news. Large numbers of U.S. troops had landed not far from the regiment's intended resting area. They were moving along predictable routes, using standard formations, sweeping toward the very stream where the regiment hoped to resupply. There was no moment of panic, no frantic debate. Instead, there was a simple, steady shift in posture. Orders passed through the regiment with calm precision. Dig shallow fighting holes. Reinforce overhead cover. Review signals for silent communication. Prepare for contact, but do not initiate it. Wait. The regiment had no plan to ambush a battalion. They didn't even know how many Americans were approaching. Their only objective was to survive the night. And then the jungle shook. At 10 p.m. on October 16th, the sky tore open as B-52 bombers unleashed a massive strike across the area near Suoi Ong Thanh. To the Americans miles away, it was routine, another preparation strike meant to soften resistance. But to the men waiting in the jungle, the bombing was a revelation. The Americans knew they were here. The Americans believed the bombs would clear the way. The Americans were coming. The explosions themselves did little damage. The regiment had dispersed widely, and many bombs fell just beyond their perimeter. But the effect on morale and alertness was immediate. Men who had been dragging their feet hours earlier now dug positions with fierce determination. Machine gun teams double-checked firing lanes. RPG gunners memorized their sectors. Colonel Tritt moved quietly among his units, repeating the same message: "Stay calm. Stay silent. We do not fire first," because he understood something the Americans did not. A firefight at night would bring overwhelming U.S. artillery. A firefight while the regiment was hungry and dispersed could lead to chaos. But a firefight at dawn when visibility was higher and the Americans were deep inside the forest could be controlled. It wasn't a trap. It was survival through patience. By dawn on October 17th, the regiment was prepared not for victory, but for endurance. Their trenches were masked beneath thick layers of leaves. Their weapons were positioned low and forward. Their scouts were already tracking U.S. movements, whispering locations through coded taps on the trunks of trees. And above them, through the slivers of morning light, they watched the Americans approach slowly, methodically, walking in single file along the edges of the stream. The Vietnamese soldiers remained motionless. Some lay in positions they had held for hours without shifting. Some controlled their breathing so tightly that the jungle swallowed their presence. They saw the shapes of American helmets. They saw the glints of rifle barrels. They saw the confusion on faces that sensed something was wrong but too late. The Americans entered the forest believing the previous night's bombing had cleared their path. The Vietnamese watched them enter, believing the forest itself was about to decide their fate. Between the two forces lay only silence, tense, fragile, waiting to break. At sunrise on October 17th, 1967, the American side of the battlefield awoke with a sense of confidence bordering on complacency. The night's B-52 strikes had echoed through the canopy like rolling thunder. To the men of the 2nd Battalion, 28th Infantry, it meant one thing. Whatever enemy presence had once existed near Suoi Ong Thanh must now be scattered, stunned, or dead. Lieutenant Colonel George E. Allen, the battalion's commander, believed the bombing had done its job. He had seen the fireballs bloom miles away, watched the shockwaves ripple through the treetops, felt the earth tremble beneath his feet. In his mind, and in the minds of many officers, no organized force could survive a bombardment like that. The jungle had something else to say about that. Before the sun even burned through the morning haze, Allen issued his orders. 2 companies, Alpha in the lead. Delta behind would move on foot into the forest to assess bomb damage and search for stragglers. Bravo Company would remain to secure the landing zone and act as a possible reserve. This decision, made with steady confidence, would soon cascade into one of the most catastrophic errors of the war. Some of the younger officers, particularly those who had seen the forest swallow entire platoons before, voiced concerns. The area was too quiet, they said. The air felt strange. The trails were too clean. The fires from old campsites were still warm. But Allen had heard it all before warnings that often proved false alarms. He dismissed the caution with a calm certainty. "We're just going out to check the field, nothing more." To his men, this reassurance felt solid. To the jungle, it felt naive. As Alpha and Delta began their slow push westward, the environment immediately worked against them. The trees were packed tightly, their roots twisting like the ribs of some buried prehistoric animal. Thorns snagged webbing, vines tangled with antennae. Sunlight filtered down only in thin, shifting beams. The forest created a sense of tunnel vision, trapping each soldier within a narrow slice of reality. No horizon, no distant silhouettes, only the next few steps ahead. Yet amid this constrained visibility, the signs were unmistakable for anyone who cared to see them. Fresh footprints, narrower, lighter than American boots, marked the mud. A faint but undeniable odor of recently smoked tobacco drifted beneath the canopy. Tiny patches of disturbed earth revealed where hammocks had been tied between trees. The jungle was telling the Black Lions a story, but no one in authority was listening. Still, there was one sound they couldn't ignore. The sound of their own movement. Every step cracked twigs. Every shift rattled leaves. Every whispered order carried farther than intended. This wasn't because the Americans were careless. It was because the environment magnified everything they did while muffling everything done by the men watching them from hidden foxholes nearby. The asymmetry was invisible, but absolute. A few men in Alpha Company felt it creeping up their spines, the sense of being observed. But in war, intuition without evidence carries little weight. and evidence, in that moment, seemed absent. The radios, meanwhile, were fighting their own battle. The thick canopy distorted signals, creating static bursts and patches of silence. As the companies moved deeper, their ability to communicate with Bravo grew weaker, then intermittent. Still, Allen urged the advance. Shortly after 8 a.m., the point men of Alpha Company approached a slight bend in the stream, a place where the banks narrowed and the foliage thickened. The ground dipped into a shallow bowl. If someone had drawn a diagram of a perfect ambush site, it would have looked almost exactly like this. But the Americans didn't stop. They had been conditioned by weeks of operations with few major contacts to interpret silence as safety. And perhaps even more dangerously, they believed the B-52 strikes ensured no large organized enemy force could be this close. The contradiction between expectation and reality tightened like a noose. Nearby, Delta Company followed the same path, spaced several dozen meters behind Alpha. Their view of the lead company was fragmented, just glimpses of movement between trunks and branches. The men knew they were vulnerable in this formation, but the terrain left them no choice. Then came a sound small, faint, almost delicate, a metallic tap, then another, then another. It echoed lightly, bouncing off wood and leaves. Some Americans looked up, puzzled. It didn't sound like a gun. It didn't sound like a bird. It sounded like communication, because that's exactly what it was. The Vietnamese soldiers hidden throughout the forest recognized the pattern instantly. It was a coded signal. The Americans were in position. For Alpha Company, it was an omen they couldn't interpret. For Delta Company, it was a warning they didn't understand. For Lieutenant Colonel Allen, it was a sound he never even heard. And for the 271st Regiment, it was the final confirmation. The moment had come. The jungle inhaled. The silence thickened. And then, without further hesitation, the forest exploded. The first shots did not sound like gunfire, at least not to the men of Alpha Company. They heard a rapid succession of sharp cracks like branches snapping underfoot, like bamboo splitting in the heat. For a split second, the point men hesitated, trying to place the noise. Then they saw the flashes bright, violent bursts erupting from 3 directions at once. The world turned white, then orange, then black. The ambush had begun. In an instant, the quiet forest erupted into a storm of violence so sudden and precise that several American soldiers never even released the safeties on their rifles. The first volley came from RPG teams hidden within expertly camouflaged fighting pits. B-40 and B-41 rockets streaked through the trees, detonating with a concussive force that split the air and ripped through the American column. The opening blast struck the very front of Alpha Company, vaporizing the lead element and sending shrapnel slicing backward like a metal hurricane. Men were thrown off their feet. Others staggered blindly, ears ringing, unable to understand what had just happened. Behind them, more rockets hammered the center of the formation. The jungle canopy caught the rising smoke and held it, trapping the Americans in a thick, choking haze. Within 5 seconds, the ambush zone became a kill zone. Automatic fire followed, controlled, disciplined, terrifyingly accurate. Vietnamese RPD machine guns and AK-47 seconds fired in short, synchronized bursts from positions so well concealed that not a single muzzle flash could be pinpointed. Their fields of fire overlapped perfectly, stitched together by months of experience fighting in terrain that offered every advantage to the defender. Alpha Company tried to return fire, but they couldn't see the enemy. They couldn't even see each other. Soldiers shouted orders, warnings, prayers, but the noise was swallowed almost immediately in the chaos. A radio man fell with a round through the chest. Another crawled toward him, only to take a burst across the legs. Men dragged their wounded behind trees that were too thin to stop bullets. Others pressed themselves into the earth, hoping the dirt itself might shield them. To the Vietnamese fighters, the Americans were silhouettes moving in smoke. To the Americans, the Vietnamese were ghosts. Within minutes, the chain of command inside Alpha Company began to collapse. Lieutenant John Chesley, the company commander, tried desperately to call for artillery support, but the radio handset in his hand sputtered and died. The antenna had been blown off. The backup unit was gone, its operator killed in the opening salvo. With no communication and no visibility, Chesley attempted to regroup what remained of his forward platoons. But every movement drew fire. Every shout was answered with an explosion. Every attempt to maneuver only exposed new angles for the Vietnamese gunners lying in ambush. It was as if the forest itself was firing. Farther back, Delta Company heard the explosions and quickened their pace. At first, the blasts were confusing, too sudden, too violent to be a routine engagement. But as they closed the distance, they encountered wounded men crawling through underbrush, faces numb with shock, uniforms torn by shrapnel. The survivors of Alpha Company shouted warnings. "They're everywhere. Don't go forward. It's a trap." But Delta Company was already entering the jaws of the ambush. The moment they stepped into the same narrow bowl where Alpha had been shredded, the second phase of the attack began. 3 more RPGs slammed into the column. One rocket struck the center, igniting ammunition packs and sending burning fragments flying in all directions. Another hit a tree, shearing it in half and dropping it across the path, cutting the company into isolated pockets of chaos. A machine gun position opened up from the flank, firing diagonally through the formation. Soldiers trying to reach the wounded were hit mid-run. A medic was shot through the shoulder as he pulled a man to cover. Another was killed kneeling over a casualty. Delta Company had walked directly into the same kill box, and now the forest was hammering them as mercilessly as it had Alpha. Behind the front lines, Lieutenant Colonel Allen attempted to orient himself. He had moved forward to assess the situation when a rocket struck a tree just feet away. The explosion threw him violently to the ground. Shrapnel tore into his torso and legs. His radio operator was killed instantly. Debris rained down like metal rain. The battalion had lost its only functioning command center. The men didn't know it yet, but they were now fighting leaderless. By 8:20 a.m., only 15 minutes after the first shot, Alpha Company had ceased to exist as a cohesive force. Delta Company was fragmenting by the minute. The jungle, so silent at dawn, now roared with gunfire, explosions, and the indistinguishable cries of wounded Americans pinned beneath fallen branches and shattered equipment. The Vietnamese forces, in contrast, operated with chilling calm. They fired in controlled bursts. They shifted positions seamlessly. They conserved ammunition, choosing targets with deliberate precision. They weren't fighting an enemy they feared. They were finishing an enemy they had already outmaneuvered. The Black Lions were being cut apart, piece by piece, under the canopy that hid their attackers and trapped their screams. And the slaughter had only just begun. The jungle swallowed Delta Company whole. By the time Captain Wayne Wiggin reached the outer edge of the kill zone, he could already feel the ground trembling beneath his boots, the concussive rhythm of explosions pounding somewhere ahead. Smoke drifted through the trees like low fog, carrying with it the metallic smell of burning ammunition and something worse, blood. He stepped around a fallen tree and saw the first bodies Alpha Company men lying twisted and still, their helmets blown off, rifles half buried in mud. The sight drained the color from the captain's face. There was no mistaking it now. This wasn't a skirmish. It was an annihilation. Delta Company surged forward anyway. They were trying to reach Alpha, trying to rescue whoever might still be alive. But every 10 steps, the jungle erupted again, rifle fire snapping from angles they couldn't see. RPGs streaking through the smoke like fiery lances. Men dove behind roots and termite mounds, but nothing was large enough to provide real protection. Delta's point platoon never even made it 50 feet. An RPG struck just left of their formation, blasting 2 soldiers into the air. Machine gun fire scythed through the survivors, cutting down the medic before he could reach the wounded. Captain Wiggin hit the ground, dirt blasting across his face, and shouted for his platoons to spread out, but the forest didn't allow it. The brush was too thick, visibility too short, enemy fire too precise. They were fighting in a tunnel of death. He raised his radio handset. "Command, this is Delta. Alpha is..." A burst of gunfire forced him to duck. Static, broken fragments of voices. Then silence. The Vietnamese fighters had not only hit the Americans, they had cut their communications artery. All around Delta, unseen riflemen fired, in short, disciplined bursts. Every sound was maddeningly controlled. No yelling, no wasted rounds. It was as if the jungle itself had turned hostile. Wiggin tried again to call for artillery support. Again, nothing. The radio operator beside him suddenly jerked backward, hit by a round that punched through his chest. Wiggin grabbed him by the collar and dragged him behind a log, but the young soldier was already gone, eyes wide open, staring through the canopy. Delta Company's last working radio died with him. Up ahead, the remnants of Alpha Company were still trying to fight, but their gunfire was fading fast, sporadic, desperate, scattered. The two units were only a few hundred feet apart, yet they were separated by a wall of enemy fire. Corporal Jim Lancer crawled forward through a tangle of vines and smoke to get a line of sight on the ambushers. Nothing. Just trees. Just shadows. Then a shadow moved. RPG. The round roared toward him, smashing into a tree. Wood exploded like shrapnel. Lancer felt a burning sting across his cheek. He wiped his face, looked down, and realized his hand was smeared with blood his own. He pressed himself deeper into the mud. "We're not getting out of this," someone whispered behind him. No one disagreed. Captain Wiggin gathered what remained of his officers, a handful of platoon leaders and NCOs. Their faces were streaked with sweat and soot. One man's helmet was cracked. Another carried half a radio strapped to his back, wires dangling uselessly. "We push forward," Wiggin said, voice steady but trembling at the edges. "We get to Alpha, we consolidate. Then we break south out of the kill zone." "Sir," a sergeant swallowed hard. Alpha might already be gone. Wiggin didn't hesitate. "We go anyway." They had maybe 40 men left who could still fire a weapon. The Vietnamese fighters sensed the shift. They tightened the noose. Machine gun fire erupted again. But now it came from new angles deeper inside the jungle, closer to Delta's rear. The Americans were being cut off from the route they came in on. To the north, fire raked the treetops. To the east, explosions echoed like rolling thunder. It wasn't random. It was coordinated. They were herding Delta Company the same way they had herded Alpha right into the dead center of the kill zone. A young private tried to sprint to a new position. A sniper's round struck him in the back. He fell face first in the mud, motionless. Wiggin felt something twist in his stomach. This wasn't a battle anymore. It was execution. For a brief moment, the gunfire dipped just enough for Wiggin to yell to his men, "Delta, move, forward, forward." The soldiers rose from the ground and sprinted through the smoke, stumbling over roots, bodies, shattered equipment. Some fired blindly into the underbrush. Others simply ran, desperate to break through. But the moment they moved, the jungle exploded again. A third wave of RPGs slammed into the clearing. One round hit a pile of ammo belts, igniting them in a chain of violent bursts. Another detonated so close that Wiggin was lifted off his feet, ears ringing, vision spinning. He landed hard face in the dirt, lungs burning, rifle knocked from his hands. Around him, the world was a blur of screams, fire, and splintered trees. When he finally pushed himself upright, the horrifying truth became clear. Delta Company was gone. Not destroyed all at once, but shattered, sliced apart, left scattered and bleeding across the forest floor. And somewhere ahead, Alpha's final gunshots were going silent. Wiggin wiped the dirt from his eyes, grabbed his rifle, and forced himself to stand. The trap had closed. The kill box was complete, and the enemy unseen, relentless, calculating, was still out there, tightening in for the final blow. Lieutenant Colonel George E. Tony Allen had led American soldiers through dozens of operations across Vietnam. He had seen ambushes, mortar attacks, and night raids. But nothing had prepared him for the chaos that swallowed his battalion on the morning of the 17th of October, 1967. He was kneeling beside a fallen tree, trying to raise Delta Company on the radio, when the jungle lit up once more. A single rocket-propelled grenade screamed out of the tree line and struck the trunk behind him. The explosion was violent, too sudden for instinct, too close for luck. Bark and shrapnel tore through the air like razor shards. The blast threw Allen sideways, slamming him hard into the ground. The world spun. The sky flashed white. Then everything went dim. When he opened his eyes, the first thing he tasted was blood. He tried to move, but pain shot through his ribs, sharp, burning, savage. His left leg wouldn't respond. He reached down and felt warm wetness soaking through his uniform. Shrapnel had ripped across his thigh and lower abdomen. His hand came away slick and red. A few feet away, his radio operator lay sprawled across the dirt helmet blown off, head turned at an unnatural angle. The PRC-25 radio beside him crackled intermittently, but transmitted nothing but static. The battalion's last functioning radio was gone, and with it their last link to artillery, helicopters, reinforcements, survival. Alan felt the weight of that realization like a stone in his chest. He tried to stand and collapsed instantly. The battle was no longer his to command. Around him, the remnants of headquarters company were scattered. A sergeant was dragging a wounded specialist behind a log. Another soldier was firing, in short, panicked bursts at shadows he couldn't see. The battalion's command group, normally the brain of the operation, was now blind, deaf, and disintegrating. Alan grabbed a nearby soldier by the sleeve. "Report," he rasped. The soldier shook his head, eyes wide, shocked. "Sir, Alpha's wiped out. Delta's pinned down. Bravo's still at the landing zone. We can't raise anyone." Alan blinked hard, fighting off the dizziness. His vision doubled, then sharpened again. "Get a message to Bravo," he said. Tell them to pull back, regroup." But even as he spoke, another wave of gunfire erupted from the east. The shots were close. Too close. Vietnamese forces were moving through the trees, tightening their circle, pushing the Americans into a shrinking pocket of jungle. The sergeant shook his head. "Sir, I don't think anyone is pulling back." 100 yards away, what remained of Alpha Company was scattered across the forest floor, wounded men lying behind logs. Some unconscious, some still firing. Lieutenant Chesley was slumped against a tree, his shoulder torn open, barely able to hold his rifle. He had lost his entire chain of command within the first 15 minutes of the ambush. Half conscious, he heard footsteps approaching through the brush. He tried to raise his weapon, but his arm refused to lift. A soldier dropped beside him, Private Jack Meyer, face streaked with smoke and fear. "We have to move, sir," Meyer whispered. Chesley shook his head. "No moving. Hold here. Hold." But Meyer could hear something else. Soft footsteps, rustling leaves, whispered commands in Vietnamese. The enemy was closing in, slowly, methodically, tightening the noose around the dying company. "We can't stay, sir," Meyer insisted. A burst of gunfire erupted nearby, hitting the tree behind them. Splinters flew like needles. Meyer grabbed Chesley under the arm and pulled with everything he had. "Come on, sir, we're not dying here." But the jungle had other plans. Back near the center of the kill zone, Delta Company was collapsing in real time. Captain Wiggin had managed to gather about 15 soldiers, bloodied, exhausted, terrified. They were out of grenades, low on ammunition, and surrounded. "We break south," Wiggin said. "Now, if we stay, we die." But the moment they moved, the Viet Cong struck again. Gunfire rippled from ahead, short, disciplined bursts. 2 men dropped instantly. Another was hit in the leg and went down screaming. A machine gun team opened up from the flank, forcing Wiggin's group to dive for cover. They were running out of forest. They were running out of men. They were running out of time. Wiggin slammed a fresh magazine into his rifle and looked into the trees, trying to locate the shooters. But again, nothing. Just shadows and smoke. "How the hell do we fight what we can't see?" a soldier cried. Wiggin didn't answer, because he didn't know. Back at the shattered battalion HQ, Lieutenant Colonel Allen forced himself upright one last time. His vision blurred, his head swam, but he knew if he didn't attempt to move the remaining men, none of them would live another 5 minutes. "Fall back," he shouted hoarsely. "Everyone fall back, west, now." But the jungle drowned him out. Gunfire erupted from behind, cutting down 2 runners. A mortar shell landed to the north, throwing dirt and fragments through the air. Men stumbled, fell, crawled. Others froze, paralyzed by fear. The battalion was no longer a fighting force. It was a cluster of broken squads, each trapped in its own pocket of terror. The Vietnamese fighters had succeeded in the unthinkable. They had severed the battalion's command. They had isolated its companies. They had destroyed its cohesion. The Black Lions were no longer a battalion. They were prey, and the hunt was nearly over. By 10:20 a.m., the sun had climbed high above the treetops, but the jungle floor remained trapped in darkness, smoke, dust, and gunpowder turning daylight into a gray haze. For the surviving Americans, time no longer moved in minutes. It moved in blasts, in screams, in the dull thud of bullets striking flesh or wood. The ambush had lasted barely 2 hours, but for those still alive, it felt like a lifetime. Captain Wayne Wiggin braced his back against a tree, his breath ragged, his uniform soaked with sweat and blood, some of it his, most of it not. Around him, the 12 men he'd managed to gather from Delta Company were fighting like cornered animals, firing in every direction just to keep the enemy at arm's length. A private beside him clawed frantically at his jammed M16. "It's not working. God, it's not." A burst of AK-47 fire cut him down mid-sentence. Wiggin shut his eyes for half a second. When he opened them, something inside him had hardened. He grabbed the private's remaining magazines and passed them out. There was no time for mourning, only for surviving. "Shift west," Wiggin ordered. "We're getting out of this pocket if it kills us." One of the sergeants shot him a grim look. "Sir, it probably will." Wiggin nodded. "Then we move faster." The westward push lasted less than 2 minutes. As the group advanced, they approached a small ravine barely 5 feet deep, filled with tangled roots and rotting leaves. It looked like a natural escape route, but the moment they dropped into it, machine gun fire erupted from the ridge above. The ravine hadn't been salvation. It had been a funnel. Rounds stitched the dirt along both walls. Chips of bark and bursts of earth exploded around them. A man to Wiggin's left was hit clean through the helmet and collapsed without a sound. Another soldier screamed as a round tore through his calf. Back up! Back up!" Wiggin yelled, but he knew there was no backing up, not with fire pouring from every angle. The enemy had anticipated their retreat before they even made it. Across the jungle, remnants of Alpha Company were still alive, but only barely. Corporal Jim Lancer had dragged Lieutenant Chesley almost 100 yards through mud and smoke before collapsing behind a fallen tree. The lieutenant was fading in and out, his wound bleeding heavily. His voice was barely audible. "Leave me. Save yourselves." Lancer shook his head violently. "No, sir. Not happening." Nearby, 2 other Alpha survivors were returning fire in erratic bursts. Their magazines were nearly empty. Their hands trembled. They'd been hit from so many directions that they no longer knew where the enemy was. A round cracked through the tree above them, showering them with splinters. Chesley stirred, whispering through clenched teeth. "They're closing in." Lancer looked into the trees and felt his stomach drop. Shapes were moving in the foliage. Slow, steady, confident. The Viet Cong were tightening their formation like hunters closing in on wounded prey. Back at the shattered battalion HQ, Lieutenant Colonel Allen fought to stay conscious. Every breath sent fire through his ribs. His vision swam in and out. He could hear fighting in every direction, Delta to the east, Alpha to the north, scattered pockets of his command group somewhere behind him. He tried to crawl toward a nearby wounded soldier, dragging his leg which no longer responded. His fingertips brushed the man's boot just as 3 gunshots cracked from the tree line. The soldier's body jerked, then fell still. Allen froze. The shots had come from less than 30 yards away. For the first time that morning, he felt something he had never felt in Vietnam. They were losing the jungle. They were losing the terrain. They were losing the battalion, and there was nothing left for him to command. At 10:45 a.m., the final blow came. Wiggin's remaining men attempted one last push southward, hoping desperately to break out of the kill zone. They formed a staggered line and advanced through a narrow clearing, only to be met by a coordinated barrage of B-40 rockets. The first RPG struck the center of the formation, knocking 3 men off their feet. The second hit a tree and sprayed shrapnel like knives. The third detonated so close to Wiggin that it blew his helmet off and sent him crashing backward. His ears rang. His body wouldn't obey him. His rifle was gone. When his vision returned, he realized the awful truth. Only 4 men were still standing, and they were falling back step by step. Wiggin crawled forward, trying to rise, and then a single sniper round cracked through the air and ripped into his side. He collapsed face first into the dirt. Delta Company's commander was down. On the northern edge of the battle, Alpha Company's survivors made their final stand lying behind fallen branches, firing their last rounds until their rifles clicked empty. When the enemy finally broke through the smoke, they didn't come charging. They moved with the cold efficiency of men who already understood the outcome. Corporal Lancer felt a hand on his shoulder. Not a blow, not a bullet, a hand. He looked up and saw a Vietnamese fighter motioning for him to stay down. Then the man moved on, disappearing into the haze. The realization struck Lancer like a hammer. The fight was over, not because Alpha had surrendered, but because Alpha no longer existed. By 11 a.m., Suoi Ong Thanh had gone silent, except for the moans of the wounded and the crackle of burning equipment. The Black Lions were broken. Their battalion commander lay wounded in the dirt, their companies shattered, their communications destroyed, their escape routes sealed. There would be no counterattack, no reinforcement, no rescue, only survivors, scattered, bleeding, lost in a jungle that no longer had room for hope. By 11:15 a.m., the gunfire had thinned into scattered cracks, isolated, hesitant, almost reluctant. The jungle, which had screamed with violence for 2 unbroken hours, now seemed to hold its breath. And in that uneasy quiet, the survivors of the Black Lions realized something horrifying. The enemy wasn't retreating. They were simply done. Not defeated, not repelled. Done because there was no one left to fight. Captain Wayne Wigan lay on his side, half-conscious, trying to breathe through the burning hole in his ribs. The world flickered in and out, distorted by pain and blood loss. Nearby, one of his last remaining soldiers, Private Harold McIntyre, was crawling toward him through the mud. "Captain! Captain!" the private said, voice trembling. Wigan blinked slowly, vision doubled. "Roll call." McIntyre shook his head. There's nobody left to call, sir." He wasn't lying. 4 men had been standing minutes earlier. Now, McIntyre was the only one who could still move. The others lay scattered around the clearing, some groaning, some silent, all broken. Wigan tried to push himself upright, but a surge of agony pinned him back to the ground. He tasted mud, he tasted blood. For the first time since landing in Vietnam, he felt the cold certainty of his own death. "Stay low," he whispered. Don't draw attention." McIntyre nodded, eyes wide with fear, because around them, movement had resumed. Not American movement, Vietnamese. To the north, Corporal Jim Lancer of Alpha Company listened to the shifting underbrush and felt his pulse quicken. He clutched his empty rifle like a lifeline. Beside him, Lieutenant Chesley lay unconscious, his breathing shallow. Shapes moved through the thick foliage, dark silhouettes weaving between trees with the same fluidity they had shown during the ambush. They were close, too close. But they weren't firing. Instead, they were checking the bodies. Not hurried, not careless, methodical. They stepped over fallen Americans, scanning the wounded, ensuring no one was still capable of fighting back. Some GIs froze, holding their breath so deeply it hurt. Others shut their eyes, praying to be mistaken for dead. A Vietnamese fighter approached Lancer's position, crouching just 5 feet away. He studied the bodies, his rifle relaxed but ready. Lancer held completely still, muscles screaming with tension. Then, the fighter spoke softly to another man. A short exchange, a nod, and he walked past. Lancer exhaled shakily. He didn't understand why they spared him. He only knew he would never forget the look in their eyes, focused, calm, almost sorrowful. These were not men killing for sport. They were killing because war had left them no other option. Farther back, Lieutenant Colonel Allen drifted in and out of consciousness. He heard footsteps nearby, soft and deliberate. Through blurred vision, he saw a group of Vietnamese fighters move past him. For a brief second, one of them paused just long enough to look at the wounded commander sprawled in the dirt. Allah met his chase. No words were exchanged. No weapon was raised. The fighter simply turned away and vanished into the trees. Allen didn't know if this was mercy or indifference. But he knew the battle was over and he wasn't dead. Not yet. By 11:30 a.m., the The Viet Cong and NVA soldiers began withdrawing with a discipline that stunned even the most seasoned American survivors. They melted back into the forest the same way they had emerged from it, silently, invisibly. No cheering, no taunting, no collecting trophies. Only the sound of boots brushing through undergrowth, fading deeper into the jungle. Within minutes, the forest had reclaimed them. The ambushers were gone, leaving behind nothing but footprints, empty shell casings, and the shattered remains of an entire U.S. battalion. And then came the silence. The kind of silence that presses into the skull. The kind that makes a man afraid to breathe. Across the clearing, scattered survivors slowly realized the shooting had stopped. Some lifted their heads, dazed. Others crawled toward cries for help. A few, those with the least strength left, simply lay still, staring blankly at the canopy above. The jungle smelled of smoke, dirt, and blood. The air hung heavy with humidity and dread. PFC Charlie Hansen, one of Bravo Company's scouts who had been separated early in the chaos, pushed himself upright against a tree. His leg was numb, his rifle empty. He listened carefully, heart thumping in his ears. Nothing. No gunshots. No shouting. Only the buzzing of insects returning after the storm. He whispered, "Where the hell? Where's everybody?" His voice cracked, because he already knew the answer. Around noon, the first American voices broke the silence, weak, trembling calls from the wounded. "Medic! Somebody help! I'm hit. I'm still here." But there were no medics left. Only other bleeding men crawling toward them. Everywhere Hansen looked, he saw devastation, burning gear, shattered rifles, bodies tangled in vines, helmets dented by shrapnel, footprints stamped into the mud where the Viet Cong had maneuvered with chilling precision. This wasn't a battlefield. It was an aftermath. The fight was over. The enemy had vanished. And the Black Lions, the men who had marched proudly into the jungle that morning, were now broken shapes lying in the mud, waiting for rescue or death, whichever arrived first. The first American helicopter appeared above the treetops at 12:45 p.m., its rotors beating the thick air like a distant drum. The survivors lying on the forest floor barely reacted, some too weak to move, others too numb to care. Only when the Huey circled lower did a few men lift their heads, eyes glassy, blinking through smoke and exhaustion. Private Harold McIntyre waved a torn strip of cloth, his arm trembling violently. "They're here," he whispered to Captain Wiggin, who drifted in and out of consciousness beside him. Wiggin didn't answer. His eyes were unfocused, his breathing shallow. But he was still alive, one of the very few officers who could say so. The Huey descended slowly, wary of hidden gunfire, but none came. The enemy had vanished hours ago. All that remained were the broken echoes of a battle whose violence still clung to the smoke-filled air. The helicopter's door gunner scanned the jungle, stunned. "Jesus," he muttered. "What happened down there?" Because from above, the battlefield looked less like a firefight and more like a natural disaster. Trees were snapped like matchsticks. Burned patches of brush smoldered with thin ribbons of smoke. Bodies, American bodies, lay scattered along the narrow stream bed, sprawled in muddy clusters where the ambush had slammed into them. This wasn't a battle line. It was a graveyard. Bravo Company arrived moments later, having finally pushed through the jungle after hours of confusion. Their boots sank into mud streaked with blood. Their faces paled as they stepped into the carnage, recognizing friends, squad mates, familiar faces now twisted in unnatural shapes. Sergeant Mark Ellison stopped dead when he spotted the helmet of a man he'd eaten breakfast with that morning. "No. God, no," he whispered, collapsing to his knees. Bravo's medics, two men, rushed frantically from body to body, checking pulses, bandaging what they could, closing the eyes of those they couldn't help. The worst part wasn't the bodies. It was the silence between them. The birds weren't singing. The leaves weren't rustling. Even the air seemed unwilling to move. It was as if the jungle itself was mourning. Lieutenant Colonel Allen was found half buried under leaves, barely breathing. When Bravo's troops lifted him onto a stretcher, his eyes fluttered open. "Report," he whispered. "Sir, we're evacuating survivors," a corporal answered softly. "You're safe now." Allen shook his head weakly. Not safe. Not here." He tried to speak again, but the words dissolved into blood and coughing. They carried him toward the medevac bird, his limp hands swaying with every step. In his fading vision, he saw the bodies of his men who had followed him into the jungle, believing they would return. Guilt sank into his chest, heavier than any wound. He closed his eyes. A few yards away, Corporal Jim Lancer was still alive miraculously. He and 2 other Alpha Company survivors had shielded Lieutenant Chesley behind a fallen log. When the rescue teams reached them, the corporal burst into tears of relief. "Thank God. Thank God you came." The medic knelt beside Chesley. "He's barely hanging on. Let's move." Lancer looked around at the bodies of his company once, over 100 strong, now reduced to a handful. Where is everybody?" he asked. The medic didn't answer. His silence told Lancer everything. For hours, helicopters ferried wounded men out of the jungle, carrying them to medical stations where surgeons worked tirelessly fighting to save limbs, lungs, and lives shattered by shrapnel and shock. By sunset, the last Huey lifted off with the final group of wounded. Below it lay the remains of the Black Lions. 75 wounded, 2 missing, nearly 70% of the battalion gone. The cost of 2 hours in the jungle. The next morning, commanders at Lai K tried to piece together the wreckage of the operation. They spoke in clipped tones, hiding emotions behind military jargon. But the soldiers who had seen the battlefield didn't use jargon. They used words like slaughter, trap, and hell. One medic, still trembling, said quietly, "It wasn't a fight, it was an execution." The battalion's official report softened the language, burying the truth under phrases like heavy engagement and unexpected enemy concentration. But the soldiers knew better. They had been outmaneuvered in every possible way by an enemy who knew the land, read the terrain, and struck with perfect precision. Months later, survivors of the ambush would gather in quiet corners of bases across Vietnam, speaking in low voices about Suoi Ong Thanh. Some cried, some cursed. Most simply stared, unable to articulate what they had lived through. For many, the jungle never really left them, not even decades later. Suoi Ong Thanh faded from newspapers and radio broadcasts, buried beneath the endless churn of war. But the men who fought there, those who died, and those who lived carried the weight for the rest of their lives. It became a private memory, shared only by those who had walked through the fire and survived its silence. And the lesson, whispered from veteran to veteran, remained carved deeper than any report. In that jungle, bravery wasn't enough. Firepower wasn't enough. Technology wasn't enough. To survive Suoi Ong Thanh, a soldier needed something the Black Lions never had: a warning. On quiet anniversaries, some survivors still returned to the clearing, now overgrown with new trees and soft grass. The stream runs clear again. Birds sing where gunfire once echoed. But if you stand there long enough, you can feel it, the weight of what happened. The ghosts of young men whose lives ended in a place far from home, in a war they barely understood. A place where silence returned, but never truly healed.